Before the show, I have an announcement of an event that's taking place on Saturday, the 28th in Warren. This is the town of Warren, which has created a veterans memorial for veterans who lived in the Peterborough community, which you've probably never heard of. Peterborough was started with the family of Amos and Sarah Peters, both slaves outside of Maine. Amos served in the American Revolutionary War, had earned his freedom with his service and moved to Maine after its ending. Sarah had been brought to Maine as a slave directly. They got married and raised a big family, and he became friends with General Henry Knox. And Knox had somebody, he says, oh, you did some good stuff here. Here's 150 acres next to the pond. So Amos Peters had a nice little piece of land to work on for all of his descendants, which I made a project out of tracing, which is why I got invited to the opening, because I helped him do a little research to find all these people that had been in the various wars. So it grew and it actually became one of the largest African-American communities in Maine. Within about in the 50s, people started drifting off. And so the cemetery is very well maintained, but it's down a very narrow little lane, and it's a small one. But anyway, they're having a big open house, and I thought I would announce it for anybody who might be interested. I could give you more details if you'd like.
Because we are going, so.
We are going.
Okay. And we have room in our car. So.
Instantly, 20 people are now coming. Us. I'm for lunch.
Yeah. So this presentation is called Mum's the Word. It's a wartime tale of secrets, intrigue, rescue, and daring with a genealogical connection. Mum's the Word, okay. Has a lot of threads to it. And I just discovered another one that I should have added this morning. So we'll point that out as we go along. And for some amazing thing, they all start with the letter M.
Except for some.
So we'll see all of these. And it has a lot of threads and a couple of sidebars, but everything will come together at the end as soon as I tell Bing I don't want to use it. Okay. Sorry for the thing there. So let's go on.
And who are you, by the way?
I am Rick Davis. Some of you probably know me. Mild-mannered president. Well, maybe not mild-mannered, but president. And today's presenter. So I started doing genealogy a long time ago, and I got my paternal grandfather's death certificate, and he identified on there, it was identified who his parents were, which were Calvin Davis and Frances Lemunyon. So I started researching the Lemunyons, about 35 years ago. And I started going back generation by generation to try to find the original, this is the way we do, go from what you know to what you don't know, right? And I got back as far as Thomas Lemunyon, who married Esther Howard in Rochester, Mass. In 1720. People often ask me, what does Lemunyon mean anyway? Well, it is French, as you may have figured out. And as you can see from the slide, it means the stump, like that of an amputee. Now, I figure that somewhere there were a couple of guys with the same first name, say like Pierre or Philippe, and they had to distinguish them between them. So one of them had an amputation of some sort, so he became Pierre Lemunyon, and the name got carried forward. That's my theory anyway. And I found that Lemunyons have a lot of different ways to spell their name. Now, at this point, this is what I was working with, was Lemunyon, right? With the L-A in front. But you can see sometimes it came with an L-E, and I mean, all kinds of different endings. And also, I didn't put all of them up here because sometimes you find it in the records with a capital M. or sometimes even a space. So it'll be La Munyon. And they're all the same folks. So I got back to Thomas and Esther, and so I started to work forward. I wanted to find all these Lamunions. And I got as far as about the 7th generation, which includes living people now. So, so I didn't go back any further. And I also kept running, I didn't go forward any further. And I kept running into people whose name was Munyon. But I thought, well, this is the La Munions. Those are that's a different something, a different group. So I focused basically on the La Munions. And then, inspired by Dana Murch of this group and others, I decided to compile my research into a book, which I'm not going to publish a book, but I'm going to make it available through Family Search when it's done. And my previous research that I'd been doing before was now about 7 or 8 years old. I hadn't looked at it since. So many more records had become available since then. And I also now had access to things like newspapers.com for obituaries and other kinds of news, which I hadn't subscribed to back in 2015. So time to kind of formalize this a little bit. And I wanted to use a consistent methodology so I didn't overlook some important thing to go check, you know, marriage records or whatever it might be. So I wanted to do the same thing all the way through. And then also write the individual family sketches also in a standardized, consistent format. One of the things, for example, I did was to make sure that in each one I indicated what birth order that father was from. Was it 4th of 7 or 2nd of 12 or whatever. And I also looked for, like, oh, he was the last one and his mother was 58 years old or whatever. Maybe not 58, but you get the point. So I wanted to keep everything kind of standardized. And the next slide will describe my methodology in more detail, or begin to describe it. And bear with me because there's a reason for going through this first half of the presentation. So I started with the Family Search. How many people use Family Search? No, about half. Okay, great. It is, it's a great, the family tree database is a very good resource. It gives you an easy way of seeing like a pedigree chart, several generations, which identifies those cousin marriages that Dana talked about last month in his presentation. It also sometimes will identify a child who was born and died between censuses. It doesn't show up in the census. And you don't know they're there unless somebody else has researched it and put that there. And often you can find a grave for that person, but you wouldn't have known to look. And sometimes it picks up multiple marriages that you may have overlooked as well. The downside is that there are a lot of errors that have not been corrected. And in a lot of cases, they don't have a lot of sources. There's a lot of people who will use the census as a source of a birth date, and I'm sorry, the census is not that precise, and it definitely does not say that your birthday is December 12th. It says you're 23 at a certain point, and that's basically it.
And for those of us that are intimidated by it, because it's still pretty confusing, I would love for somebody to teach us how to make it more effective.
The census or Family Search? Family
Search, because I stay away from it on purpose.
Oh, okay. Well, we can probably do that. We have a whole year's programming to have next year. Okay, then within Family Search, I just recently kind of relearned this. There's a link on each of the pages for people that takes you directly to an ancestry search for that person. That's a lot more efficient than writing all that stuff in the ancestry window and coming up with 150 matches. So let me just show you where that is. Now I get to use my thing first use. Okay, so you basically go to, here's your first lesson. You go to the home screen, and then you go to search, and it's under, give me notes here. I do it so automatically, I don't even think about it. You click on the family tree, which is one of the menu items, and then you find, and then under the search, you can put in that kind of stuff you would put in an ancestry, you know, birth dates and whatnot. And then you select the right person because it'll show you other people that they think might be it. And then you want to click on the person view, which is what this is. There's the tree view, which is the one I just talked about, which is like a pedigree chart. And down here in the corner, under search records, there's a whole list of other places. And the second one is Ancestry. And when you click on that little button, it will open up a new window, and that search will have all of the stuff that's listed here as the search terms. So it's really very almost precise. So you save a lot of wasted time.
So are you saying you open that because you're importing this information into your Ancestry?
No,
Or just that it's already
I'm
there?
saying this will open up the Ancestry program
Oh, okay,
with that search information.
okay,
And Ancestry has the sources that,
okay,
Right,
that
right,
perhaps Family Search does not.
okay,
right. Yeah, exactly.
thank you.
Although like in this case, she's got 8 sources. This is my great grandmother. Remember the name? Frances LeMond. So there are 8 sources here, some of which are probably, there are 5 sources for her birth, and but no sources for her death, but they know when it happened. I know when it happened too. I got her death certificate, but that as it may. So that's just a little tip for those of you that have used Family Search. To click on, start with Family Search, but then go over to Ancestry that way, and it'll be a new window, so you don't lose anything. So then after I do that, I go to Find a Grave, which I imagine most of you, if you're doing genealogy at all, are somewhat familiar with. It will often provide details of birth and death, and sometimes additional information. So for example, it may contain transcribed or even photocopied obituaries. It often contains links to entries for parents, spouses, siblings, and children. Also, it allows for quick surname searches within Find a Grave to other people with the same last name in different, this cemetery, this county, this state, etc. So the next slide will show you Frances LeMond. Again, this is her entry at Family Search. I'm sorry, at Find a Grave. And you can see here lots of details about her birth and death, where she's buried. This photo, which I can attest is accurate, I've been there. Corliss and I found this cemetery on a dirt road in the middle of, well, not the middle, at the edge of Kansas. We almost had given up, but there it was. And a little bit of it, this is actually a photo of an obituary from a newspaper, not identified, but at least it gives you the little text there. Here are her parents identified, and these are links. So if you click on it, it'll take you to their Find a Grave entry. Down below here that you can't see because the screenshot didn't go far enough, it'll show information about her children and her siblings. And over here is where you have the opportunity to find more. And in case of women with maiden names, you can search on more people with her married name or with her maiden name. So you could look to see if there are any more Lemondians or Davises in the Highland Cemetery, or in Jewell County, which is the place in Kansas, or in Kansas altogether, or even in the US. If you hit the US, you're going to get a lot of it. But that's just very handy to be able to go back and forth. Yes.
And don't take it as gospel because anyone can add anything in there. And so Deb and I are going crazy and trying to fix some things that got put in there that are just.
Oh, and Find a Grave?
Yeah.
Yeah, good luck for that, because it's easy. You can set up a free account.
Yeah.
And you can contact the person who puts it on there, but they may say, well, I'm not taking any corrections.
Or they're dead.
Or they're dead. And they're still not taking any corrections. So it's, I mean, the best thing sometimes you can do is just, you can actually put a little entry on the bottom there.
So a combination of a couple things to
Yeah,
sources,
yeah.
But it is an interesting place to go.
Yeah, yeah, and there's
So you can put
a lot of
comment
stuff
in
in one
if it's
place.
Yeah.
It's
something
very
wrong.
handy.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, especially with those links.
Mhm.
So step 4 was to go through all the applicable census returns, including state censuses. That means all, because I have found sometimes people's names change from one census to the other. First name, middle name, nickname,
Switch the
whatever.
first and second around.
I've even,
change
yeah,
the spelling.
I've even seen it where the person's sex changed in the 10 years.
But that happens, so you know.
Well, I understand, because you always have to remember the census was taken by marshals who were probably no better educated than the people they were talking to, who were in some cases people that had no education. So they wrote down what they heard and they made assumptions, and they might have even talked to the neighbor if the other people weren't there. Oh yeah, they've got this Billy. Well, is that a girl or a boy? They assumed it's a son. It turns out it's a Wilhelmina. So you need to look at all of them and kind of track that. My favorite census is 1900, actually, because this is one that shows how long the couple has been married and how many children she has born and how many are still living. And the same information is available in 1910 also, so you can actually compare. Oh, look, she had like 4 children before, but she's got 6 now, but there's only, the one is no longer living. So you know there's one of those little in-betweens. Those are the only 2 years that they did that. So, but that's one of the reasons I really like it. And number 5, suggested records. This is at Ancestry when you do your search. And then over on the side, they have this whole list of suggested records, which for the most part, probably 80% of the time are relevant in some way. And that may include birth, marriage, death records, records from the children. You know, if your children get married and your name is on there, then they'll pick that up and put that on there. It's like, oh, good, there's the marriage. Oh no, it's their kid's marriage. Sometimes military records or other kinds of things. So, so that's why checking that suggested record is helpful. And number 6, I would go back to Family Search, but this time it's a more global thing. I found out that they have, this is this is actually part of the home screen. Under search, you can search all these different things. Remember I said to get to the family tree, or you could also go up here. But there are books. You know that the Family Search folks, the Family Search Library, I think it's called, in Salt Lake has more genealogy materials than anywhere else in the world, in the side of a mountain. And they have hundreds of thousands of books, and many of them they have made available online, and many of them are marked private, so you can't see them. But if you've got a name like Wawenoc, you go in there and there might be 60, 70 books that have a Wawenoc somewhere in there. So you can kind of scroll down and find some fairly good stuff sometimes. If you're looking for, you know, Roberts, that may not be so good. And then the research wiki is very, very helpful. That's not part of this presentation. The catalog is a set of records that are arranged geographically, and I will get into that. In fact, I think that might even be the next slide, but the one after that. No, this is it. When you click on catalog, it defaults to a place search. I have had almost zero luck doing anything other than surnames or than place searches. I put a surname in there and it's never what I'm looking for. But the places give you access to a whole lot of records. And they have a kind of a tricky way to put it in there. So I'm going to share that. Also note that there are 3 different categories here of availability of the record you've got. You can select, you can say any. I want to see everything that you own that pertains to this location. Online is everything they've digitized and put online and made available. So I usually use that one. And the third one is Family Search Center, which means you can only see that set of records, which are mostly digitalized microfilms, at a Family Search Center. And guess what?
Belfast.
Yeah.
We are one.
Oh.
So you're no
Yeah,
longer
sure.
have to go to Bangor or something
Mhm.
to see these things. You just have to be here.
Yeah, there may be some things though, because they do differentiate between affiliate libraries and
Yeah,
centers.
yeah, some things they have.
Yeah, so we can see more than you would online, but
Okay.
there may be a select few things that you do have to go to Bangor for. They're not very clear on exactly what they are. but-
Well, and these restrictions are mostly ones that people have put up. So like you'll find that some local, like county records, like probates or deeds, they will say, no, I want you to only make that available in your center. Because everybody else, I want them to write to us and we'll sell them a copy of the MD.
Yeah.
So it's usually restricted in some way like that. So. Okay, so for recent. I didn't go through this. Can I go back up one? It didn't work, and I clicked it. They want you to start with the largest place and then come down. So if I was looking for records about Belfast, I would have to start with Maine. And then I would get a little green bar, and you click on that, and it would say Maine up there. And then Belfast. And again, it would give you a green bar, and you click on it, right, Belfast, comma, or Maine, comma, Belfast. So just a little kind of a backwards.
Can you put in multiple, like, Waldo County or Belfast, Lincolnville, Searsville?
You could actually, you're right, you could do that by the county level, it's a level at a time, so it's the
Okay.
state, the county, the city.
Okay,
Good question. All right, back to the next slide. For recent deaths, this is still back in my methodology now. It's a long thread. For recent deaths, like after about 1900, I've looked for newspaper obituaries because they really are a great source of information. And the two places that I use, I got subscriptions to two newspaper publications, apps. One is newspapers.com, which is part of Ancestry, and you can get a discount on it if you have an Ancestry membership, and they refer to their own newspaper.com obituaries in their searches. So that's convenient. Also, I subscribe to something called genealogybank.com. And that has more recent obituaries, and it also has the Social Security Death Index. So you can search for somebody and it will say, oh, well, I've got an entry in the SSDI. And then you can look at that and say, and I have these 3 obituaries. So you can do that at the same time with the same search. It pops up. So that's kind of handy too, but that's much more recent. And then lastly on here, a general search on names, dates, and location in the databases, especially in newspapers.com. So I'll put in like Munyon, La Munyon, and dates and a location like a state or, even more refined. I've been working recently on a group that lived in Des Moines, Iowa. So I can just put Des Moines in there. It'll pick up anything in the Des Moines newspapers. And Des Moines being the biggest city in the state, they have a lot of statewide stuff. Because, you're probably not going to get a subscription to the Red Cloud, Nebraska newspaper in here. That's where my father was from. Also Willa Catherine. So I use this. And so I'm doing my research and I start back with step 1. Remember, this is I go to family search first. And the tree view, not the person view, the one that looks like a pedigree chart. And I've given you here a little snippet of what I found, because remember I had gone back to Thomas LeMunyon and Esther Howard, but when I put their information in, up came this entry for William and for Mary Langley. Never heard of them before. So it's like, oh, so it says that this was his father and mother, William, and I had to do a little research on this. Why does it say Munyon, LeMunyon?
Yeah.
Because the person who put this information in, I think maybe have taken it from the Find a Grave entry, which said It used to be Munyon, but then some people changed it to Munyon, so he put both of them in there. Doesn't make a lot of sense. I call that a silly last name.
I actually think it's a good idea because it means that, I mean, I know that that means it could be one of the other things and that people in the family switch back and forth and that look
Yeah.
for both names.
I would prefer a diagonal slash.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
between.
or
that would be fine.
parentheses.
I will do that, and then I say, because
Okay.
I've done that too, it's like, well, it's either Ted or Theodore, and it can depend.
Yeah.
Or
But this
Munyon
way,
or Munyon.
search will bring up either one if you put in a diagonal slash,
Well, no,
and it will have to look for both of them together.
right, well, yeah, so the point is, that it could be either one. The other thing is that according to this, Thomas's mother was Mary Langley. I'm really skeptical about this. The only source that is given for her identity is her death record in England at the age of 97, which would be, here you see, from 1645 to 1742, using her maiden name. Seems a little off.
Pretty.
So what the person that posted this says, well, after her husband died, because he died in like 1700, she went back to England, except that she didn't really come from England in the first place, as far as I know. So take that one with about 1.5 pounds of salt.
So is Esther Howard,
Esther Howard is real.
but is she a Mayflower Howard?
I really haven't tracked her back so far. I think it's sort of, she's there, but they don't have records for her. There is a Howard on the Mayflower,
Yes,
or there's a line.
yeah.
Could be, could be, good thing to pursue. The other thing I would point out when you're using this is you see this little down arrow here and here. That tells you, that'll get you a drop down that lists all of the children. So when you do that for under William, it says Thomas, but it also mentions Edward, Munyon. So now it's like, oh, so all those Munyons that I was saying, that's some other group? Maybe not. So anyway, now I have a little sidebar. This does not begin with an M. These folks were all from the Isle of Jersey. You probably don't know a lot about the Isle of Jersey. I didn't know much about it either. The Isle of Jersey is I'm going to show you a map in a second, is a British Crown dependency. This is important because it means that it's not subject to control by the Parliament. It is a direct dependency run under the governance of the Crown. This island is about 14 miles off the coast of Normandy. It's about 9 miles wide from west to east and about 5 miles long from north to south. It's about 20% bigger than the city of Belfast in area. And the governance was separated from Normandy in 1204 when the French lost a bunch of wars and they got kicked out of everything, and England got to keep Jersey, which is on this map. Now here's the big map of Europe, and England, and there's France, and right there is Normandy. And if you expand that, here's Normandy, there's England, there's the Channel, and this little circle here is where Jersey is. The other one is Guernsey. So you can see it's just off the coast. So they belong to England, they're a crown dependency, but they speak Norman. Not even French, it's a Norman dialect from the 1700s. So now we're going to go back to Munyons and Munions, but first we have to get a little bit of history to understand why this has come about. James I was the first Stuart king. He took over right after Elizabeth I, and he had also been James VI of Scotland. And he, unlike some of his descendants, died a natural death in 1625. Charles I was his son, who took over in 1625, and he was not popular. And right about this time, there was something called the English Civil War. which was between the royalists, ta-da, and the parliamentarians, sometimes called the Roundheads, and predominantly Puritans. And this raged, a lot of people died, and there were long battles. This war began in 1642. Charles I, he was captured, and he was tried for treason for using his power for, this is what they charged him with, for using his power for his own interests rather than for the good of the country, and found guilty. And then he lost his head in 1649. So that made his son, Charles II, the king, right?
No.
No. He was crowned King of Scotland, but then the English parliamentarians beat the Scots, and then Charles beat feet to get out of town and headed toward France, stopping in the Isle of Jersey on the way. So that's Charles II. You see here in 1660, he gets restored. They've had enough of the parliamentarian or the parliamentary law. They wouldn't even let people go to the theater. So that group gets kicked out. Parliament comes back and says, we're going to have Charles come back and be king all over. And Charles II, in his temporary exile, hooked up in Jersey with a fellow by the name, I'm going to say this the French way, I don't know how they pronounce it, but I'm going to say Sir George Carteret. And Carteret became a very good friend and defender. The parliamentarians came by and tried to invade Jersey. He got an army together and repelled them, and Charles went and was very appreciative before he headed off to Normandy and other parts south. So when he got restored in 1660, Charles II picked Carteret to be on his privy council, and then gave him large tracts of land in North America, right near New York. And Carteret immediately named that area what?
New Jersey.
New Jersey. So that's how it got its name. So now I know I got to include the Munions and Munions, two different spellings, along with the Munions for my new book. So along the way down, I got to back down to about the 7th generation, and I came across a man by the name of Curtis Munion, who was a descendant of Edward Munion from the Munion line, not the La or Mu. And he was born in Utica, New York in 1923. His father was Ivan Curtis Munion, hence the name, and Elizabeth Watson. Ivan's kind of an interesting guy too. He spent his childhood growing up in this is what it was called, the New York State Institute for the Feeble-Minded. His father, Ivan's father, was an engineer, and he was an engineer living at the Institute. So when the boiler went off at night or whatever, they needed engineers to do. And this kid grew up there. So Ivan's son, Curtis, meanwhile, who is, am I ahead or behind?
Are you here?
I think I'm behind. I'm on a different slide. Back up one.
This one?
There we go.
Okay.
So Curtis is born in 1923 and enlisted in the Navy on the 16th of December, 1941, and actually was mustered in March of 1942. So now I'm looking at Curtis's obituary. He's survived by blah, 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 and cousins. He retired for NYS DOT as an electrician supervisor. He was a veteran of World War II, serving in the U.S. Navy aboard submarines in the Atlantic and Pacific, of which he was very proud, as you'll see in a second here. He was a longtime member of the American Legion Post 1645, having served as past commander, a lifetime member of the VFW, member of the Submarine Veterans of World War II, Submarine Veterans Incorporated, the Binghamton New York, Elks, and the Knights of Columbus. So I read this and I went, submarines. That's kind of interesting. And I got nobody else that's in submarines. So let's see what that's about. So I did a general search of the newspapers, right? And this article showed up. This is Curtis Augustus Munyon, and that's his mom. This is from the Veterans Day issue in 2007 of the Binghamton Press and Sun Bulletin. So they were doing a feature on veterans, and it happened to be that Curtis's daughter was a journalist whose name was Alexandra Lee Munyon. And she'd grown up hearing all these stories from Dad. And, you know, it's like, I don't know, not really sure how much of that's actually true. That is, by the way, a submarine. And so she happened to be, before this article appeared, she happened to be interviewing or talking to a retired, what was his, retired
Brigadier General.
Brigadier General, right? Did it say that? No. And she asked, she started talking about her dad and the submarines and what patrols he had been on. And when she named the sub and said it was the 3rd patrol, he said he was on that patrol. And so he proceeded to tell her about that. And she did a little research on it. And she decided that, well, maybe it was important after, or go back. This is from the article. What I thought was just another of Dad's war stories was actually an important episode in the war in the Pacific. When the records were declassified in the late 90s, that's how secret it was. We're talking 50 years later. The one patrol made such a spectacular story, a book was written about it, Rescue by Stephen Trent Smith, Wiley, the publisher, and I got an interlibrary loaned it and got a copy, read that. And the History Channel made a documentary movie about it. One patrol. All right. So now, here, this is the ship he was on was called the Crevalle, C-R-E-V-A-L-L-E, and it is in the Balao class of submarines. And this is a picture of a typical Balao submarine. They're 311 feet long, 27 feet wide, very skinny. And they displace 1,500 tons. It was built in Portsmouth, actually, in New Hampshire, and it carried a crew of 80, 8 officers, 72 enlisted men, and 24 torpedoes. 6 in the front, 4 in the four in the aft, and another 14 for backups. And there's a Maine connection to this story because the captain of this sub, maybe this is not the Crevalle, but the one that Curtis was on, was Lieutenant Commander Frank Walker, who was born in Vassalboro in 1914. So there's a Maine connection as well as Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And the Crevalle is going to have a key role in the rest of the story and a lot of these other threads. So let's get going. We're going to start talking about the missionaries. I want to give a setting. The time of this story is early 1944. It begins on Negros Island, the Philippines, which got its name from the Spanish who came over and found a lot of very dark-skinned inhabitants. And so this was the Negros Island. So that's where it got its name. And remember, at this time, the Philippines was a commonwealth governed by the United States. It is the 4th largest island in the Philippines and the most populous. Most of us have never heard of this. Today, 5 million people live on this island, which is that one. This is Borneo. These are the Philippines, and this little red, funny-looking shape here is Negros Island. Now, missionaries. Most of them were families that had come from U.S. denominations, the Presbyterians or whatever. And some of them had actually been in China. And when China was overrun, they were pulled out, and many of them were sent down to the Philippines. In 1941, Negroes Island contained 19 adult American missionaries, including wives, and 13 children. Silliman, which I labeled university on here, and you'll see why in a second, was an institute that was established by Presbyterian ministries, missionaries in 1901. And it grew very rapidly and was considered, quote, the most influential Protestant institution of higher learning, unquote, in the Philippines. And in 1938, it became the first such school outside of Manila to be designated a university. So it was very well regarded. And many of the missionaries and or their wives taught at Silliman. When the war came and the Japanese overran the Philippines in 1942, they were at risk because most of them were Americans. So they're the enemy. So they fled into the mountains. A lot of them were helped in the jungles, were helped by the students they had taught, and also the congregants and congregations that they had founded. So they got a lot of help from the folks that were there who weren't too fond of the Japanese anyway. And they provided means to help them escape, get them fixed up in the jungle somewhere, then bring them as much supplies as they could gather together to help them continue. So they were really helped a lot. A key figure in all of this was a man by the name of Salvador Absidi. And he was head of the ROTC at Silliman. And when the Japanese took over, he became the head of the guerrilla resistance on Negroes Island. And having military background, very handy. Another thread. In addition to missionaries, we had a group of what I've called manufacturers, mostly because it starts with M. Basically, it was sugar cane. Negroes produces more sugar than anywhere else in the Philippines, even today. And it was dominated by several families that lived in what they called haciendas, which became like little towns with the equipment and the barns and the processing and all the workers living all right there in these hacienda areas. And most of these families had connections back with the US. In some cases, they were mixed American, Filipino, or they might be Americans that come over as a family or whatever. And when the Japanese took the Philippines, the sugar families took to the jungles along with the missionaries. But these people were wealthy, so they often had second homes up in the mountains, probably summer homes, I suppose. So they already had that established, and they had a lot of resources that the missionaries didn't. And with that, the US forces began supplying the guerrillas and extracting Americans from the Philippines using submarines. So the missionaries and the manufacturers faced a choice of dangers. They could stay hidden, or they could try to leave. And here's some of the thinking that they would have had to go on through. To leave, they lived in a jungle that was surrounded by the enemy. They faced a 2-week march to the shore where they could get picked up. Again, through treacherous territory. The sub, if it arrived, had to sail through 1,500 miles of ocean, which was controlled by the Japanese, pick them up, and then drive back. And so the submarine, once they got there, might not even arrive for a month or more. So would you risk staying in place, or would you risk going through all that to maybe try to get rescued? Because if you were caught in place, the best you could hope for was to be put in a prisoner of war camp. Or worse. So now we come to another thread, a merchant. And I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name, but I'm going to give it a shot. Pedro Gantuanco. He lived on Cebu, which is the island just the other side of Negros, just east, and he ran a small store there. In the 31st of March of 1944, there was a typhoon in the South Pacific. And during the typhoon, a Japanese transport plane made a crash landing in the water a mile or so off the island of Cebu. The survivors of the crash had to swim ashore where they were quickly captured by the guerrilla fighters. The next morning, Pedro spotted a briefcase washed up on the beach. Inside the briefcase were several items, including a pouch of papers written in Japanese. Some of the papers were wrapped in silk and bore official-looking seals. Sensing that these might be kind of important, Pedro buried the briefcase at his mother's house until he could decide what to do with it. Smart, because the Japanese wanted their property back, and they made it very clear they were going to come around to people's houses and stores and, you know, do you have anything? We're looking for all this different kind of stuff. And when they got to Pedro, that's much easier to say, he could truthfully say he didn't have anything from there because it was half a mile up the road in his mom's house. And after they left, they quickly got out and dug it up, and he handed it over to the Cebu guerrilla commander, who was a man by the name of Captain James Cushing. So now Cushing's got this thing, and it's probably some kind of important paper and other stuff in here, and he wants to know what to do with it. So they have radios that they can, each group can contact each other on their radio signals, or they can actually contact the Southwest Pacific Area Command in Brisbane, Australia, which happens to be where McCarthy is, and all the rest of the allies. I'm going to say SWIPA when I come to that, because that's too much to say. So he contacted them on the radio, and they just didn't answer back, and try again, and they would say, well, we're waiting, we're looking for an answer. And they didn't really take this very seriously. And then the Japanese offered a reward of 50,000 pesos, which is about $25,000 in 1944 for certain papers. Well, that seems like they must have really wanted this back. But still, SWIPA, they kind of wondered, maybe there was something important, but they didn't do anything about it. Anybody that's, I have not been in the military, but I understand that one of the mottos there is hurry up and wait, which is what Cushing was doing, waiting for instructions. Now we have a thread of a message. The US had broken the naval code of Japan back in 1942. And on the 3rd of May, 1944, remember when the typhoon was? 31 March? The Japanese headquarters sent a message out that Admiral Koga had died in the performance of his duties. Didn't say when. Minichi Koga was the commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet. The message didn't say when he died. So the announcement of his death came only 33 days after the typhoon. Folks in Australia finally woke up. There's these papers that have all these fancy seals and stuff and are tied in silk and all this that Cushing keeps bugging us about. And he got them about the same time that Koga died. Maybe there is something to it. So the Army Command asked the Naval Command in Australia which submarine was closest to Negroes Island. Can you guess which one it was? The Preval, with Curtis Munyon on board. It was just 2 days away off Borneo. So they had the Navy dispatch the sub to retrieve his papers. The next slide shows you the top secret message that the captain got. Top secret. Proceed to Balatong Point, position north of Basay, Negroes Island, and he gave the geographic coordinates, latitude and longitude. At sunset, 11 May, observe security signal, which prearranged was 3 lights. I think it's like 50 yards apart at night. Surface and receive from the boat flying the US colors. Remember, this is off Philippines, which is run by the Japanese now. 25 passengers and important documents. That's all it said. Captain wasn't too thrilled with this. Get a bunch of refugees. I'd rather be out here shooting ships down with my torpedoes. But we got to obey the commands. So following orders, the Preval arrived on the 11th of May. And there were now not 25, but 40 evacuees he was greeted with, 21 children, 11 women, and 8 men. Some of the men decided to stay back and do their missionary thing. So here's this submarine, 80 men taking on 21 kids and 11 women. And some of them were from the missionaries and some were from the manufacturers. You see how the threads are starting to come together here a little bit. So the amazing thing is that they got everybody on board. Now remember, the crew size of this ship is 80, and they're picking up an additional 40. So there's a 50% increase in the population on this 311 by 26 foot thing. So they housed the women and children in the forward torpedo room. There was a little room for some of the, they got some of the torpedoes out and there were tubes and all of this. And so the little kids and their moms were there and the men were dispersed among the rest of the accommodations. And they also, of course, had to feed them, find a place for them to sleep, keep them occupied, sanitation, all of that had to be taken care of. So a little complicated, but amazingly, they got all those people who were not used to being on a big military ship, much less a submarine, and all the supplies off, these people on, and the important documents on in 41 minutes, which I think is pretty amazing. So now I come to another thread. This is mines. Not really, but it starts with that. En route to Australia, the captain of the Crevalle saw a Japanese convoy. And remember, this guy's kind of trigger happy. So he still had a bunch of torpedoes on board and he wanted to use them. So he uses the periscope, finds this convoy, but he makes a mistake. He doesn't make the periscope go all the way around or up. So he's looking at this convoy and heading for it and doesn't know there's a flare right overhead saying, submarine, and a destroyer's coming up on the side. And by the time his first mate says, did you do a complete scan? And, oh my God, here's 2 more destroyers coming. So dive. And pretty soon, all the destroyers were dropping mines or depth charges onto this sub. A depth charge is sort of like a trash can full of a lot of explosives, very big thing. And they're set to go off at a certain depth, different depths. Of course, they figured he was pretty close to the surface, but they didn't have to put it down too low. And if it goes off and there's a sub nearby, it's probably going to get damaged. But it almost never destroys the sub because you've got to be almost a direct hit. Because remember, you got water in between and stuff. But still, not a pleasant experience if you're on the sub, I'm sure. So here's the damage report from that attack. Both periscopes, they have 2, were put out of commission, and the radar. The gun mounts were damaged. Something called the diving planes were damaged. The diving plane is what keeps the submarine level as it goes up and down. Because, you know, when you're going to dive, you don't want to go like this because everything's going to shift, right? And likewise coming up. So those do that, and they were damaged. They wouldn't deploy. And they had to be on silent running so that they couldn't be heard down there. And that meant all sources of sound were cut off, including the ventilation, the air conditioning system, and even unnecessary talking. So that you were silent. There was a movie about this called Unsilent on Deep back in the 50s, I think it was. So there they are. With the air conditioning off, the temperature rose inside the sub to 125 degrees. But luckily, they were successful in getting down low and hiding and then creeping away as much as they could with that much damage. And they had to fix everything, of course. And Curtis Munyon, pardon me, Noel, was an electrician's mate, 3rd class. So he's got to have been involved in fixing one of those many things, maybe all of them. A pretty busy fellow for a while. So the Crevalle arrived safely in Darwin, Australia on 19th of May, 8 days after it left Negros. That's pretty good. And it was met by the base commander in person. A little unusual. he took the pouch of papers and forwarded them to SWIPA headquarters in Brisbane, Australia, across the island. But this kind of gives you an indication that now they're thinking that there's something big here. And it turned out to be extremely valuable because, whoops, go to our next one. Yes, MacArthur, another M, another thread, was the supreme commander of SWIPA, which included Australians and a few folks from other countries. And he had divided his forces, not geographically, but, and I'm going to show you a map in a minute, but by force. So he had the Army, he had the Navy, and he had a commander for the air forces, which was still Army air or Navy air at that time. So that's why the Army folks had to communicate with the Navy folks, because they were in different divisions. And he'd been assigned as to be the supreme commander of SWIPA in April 1942. He was only there a month before that happened, because he had left, remember, he left the Philippines and said, I shall return. So here's our map. And I want to point out a couple things here. There are the Philippines. There's Borneo, where the Creval had been. This is New Guinea over here. Of course, there's Australia. Darwin is like right up in here. So to get to there from here, there's Negroes. They would have had to gone through here, and through here, and through there, and through there, and there. And all controlled by the Japanese. This is actually a map from 1942, but this is where the dividing line was at that time. The Japanese had everything west of that line. And Australia pointed that out. And I also want to point out the Marianas, which is a little chain of tiny islands right up in here. You may have heard of Iwo Jima. That's right up there. And Guam is just south of those islands. So, MacArthur. That's because Z is not an M. By 1944, the Japanese were actually losing the war slowly. The Americans were taking island after island after island and getting settled in. But the Japanese had this strategy they called I'll do my best with this, Kantai Kessen, which means an all-out decisive battle. They were going to get all of their forces in one place at one time. And it was going to be so massive that the Allies would be forced to capitulate. And they had done this successfully in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. So they figured they would do it again in World War II. And early in 1944, Admiral Koga, remember him? He had won approval for such a plan, codenamed the Z Plan. You tried it in Wikipedia. I'm going to read you now the preamble to this plan, translated into English. The combined fleet is for the time being directing its main operations to the Pacific area, where in the event of an attack by an enemy fleet occupation force, it will bring to bear the combined maximum strength of all our forces to meet and destroy the enemy and to maintain our hold on vital areas. And I added the underlining. But that was just a preamble. On the night of 31 March, Admiral Koga had been leaving his headquarters at Palau, which is between New Guinea and the Philippines, heading back to Japan, and he hit the typhoon. His plane crashed, and all aboard were killed. Meanwhile, there was a second plane carrying his chief of staff, Shigeru Fukudomi, who had the briefcase that belonged to Koga. He's the chief of staff. He's kind of the gopher. And when Fukudomi's plane crashed near Cebu, remember that? He had to swim for shore. Well, the briefcase stayed on the plane. So I figured, well, it's okay. It's lost. Well, it didn't sink. Apparently, it floated into the beach. So guess what happened to the briefcase after that? We kind of know, don't we? Then Koga was replaced by a guy named Admiral Toyota. And he made a couple of fatal errors that didn't help anything. There was an attack on an island called Biak near New Guinea by the Allied forces. And he thought that's where it's going to be. They're going to have their big attack in New Guinea. So he sent a couple of battleships down there, which are very long, very powerful, very slow ships, and a bunch of other ships to help that along. And the Allies now had the Z plan because it was apparently not even written in code. It was just straight Japanese because they didn't expect it to get captured. So they had these Japanese translators who translated it quickly, and they figured out what was going to happen. And they knew that the plan was to send the land, the Navy, and the air all together, especially the air forces, both land-based and sea-based. So the Americans produced a surprise afternoon airstrike in the Marianas, where those were much closer to Japan, actually, on the 11th of June of 1944. And it was a surprise for one reason, well, two. It wasn't where Toyota thought it was going to be. And number two, it was in the afternoon. They figured it was going to be a morning thing because the sun is in the east and you wouldn't be able to see the planes as well. So that's what you want to attack if you're coming from the east. But then they can't. Well, they just mastered them and wiped out a whole bunch of so I don't think I've got the numbers on this one. But Toyota he still thought this was just a diversion, but he was wrong. The actual battle that took place really stressed the importance for the first time of aircraft carriers. There were 24 aircraft carriers combined in the ensuing sea battle. The Japanese lost 107 planes destroyed and 70 heavily damaged, and that's just in this battle. Before that, remember, a lot of the planes that had been on land got targeted and bombed, and they couldn't even take off. They were destroyed. The airways were destroyed. So this is all they had left was on the aircraft carriers, and a lot of them got injured. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 9 carriers. The Allies lost 4. So obviously a very decisive kind of result. And it led to something called the Battle of the Philippine Sea on the 18th of June, when the two navies met en masse. And we don't know how that battle would have gone if the Allies had not had the Z plan, which came from the briefcase, which came from the plane, which came from Admiral Koga via a whole bunch of threads to get to that. So that's the story of this. And I have a little epilogue here. The official records of the Creval's patrols were not made public until the early 1990s. I mentioned that before. Stephen Trent Smith, a journalist, wrote a book called The Rescue about these events. It was published in 2001. And that was 6 years before the newspaper article written by Alexandra about her father. And probably he never knew about the book. He never apparently didn't mention it to her. And she just put it was one of those submarine stories, But this one was a little bit more significant than most of the ones he was involved in. And after the war, you can see Curtis settled in Binghamton. He worked as an electrician for NIDOT. They called it NYS-DOT in the obituary. That's my doing. Using skills he learned in the Navy. And he married twice. He married a woman by the name of Dorothy Gilson in 1948 after the war. She died in 1986 and married a second time to Patricia West, who survived him when he died in 2011 at the age of 87 and had led quite an exciting life, at least for a few years there, and produced 3 children, 2 stepchildren, and a whole bunch of grandchildren too. So that's the story of Curtis Munyon and how I got to find out about him. And I hope that you enjoyed learning about him and some of his exploits and those of others that surrounded him.
That's great.
Any questions? Yes.
I got lost as to why we went to Jersey.
Out in Jersey.
Well, they had all this free land over in the colonies, which wasn't the colonies then. Because remember the Carteret had gotten a whole bunch of land in what is now New Jersey. And you know, if you're on this little island and you keep having children, pretty soon there's not a whole lot of land.
So that was how the Lemonians came.
That's how the Munions or
Munions.
Lemonians or whatever you call them.
Yeah.
They were on Jersey.
They were on Jersey and they came here. Edward and Thomas, their two sons, and the only ones I know about, were born here. They were born in like 1685 and 1688, something like that. So they were here before that. The father was.
Was that West Jersey or East Jersey? Because New Jersey was.
Well, actually, most of the Munions didn't actually settle, didn't end up settling in Jersey. They ended up settling in Connecticut or Massachusetts or other places. And after that, I think in 1920, I looked at Ancestry and they were in there were like 47 different states.
Wow.
Because they just kind of, you know, go west, young man, and they went west and south and north and all over the place. So they didn't stay put long.
There were two parts of Jersey.
There were two parts of Jersey.
Two different men were given.
Well, yeah.
land, I think.
Yeah,
I don't remember.
I don't remember which was which.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could guess, but some of them did end up in near the Camden area, near Philly. So whatever part that would have been. A good question. I should research that. Other questions? Others waiting for the snacks?
So I want to know how the guy you just told the whole story about, how are you related to him? What's the?
I think I figured out he was something like a fifth cousin, twice or three times removed, or maybe seventh cousin. See, my folks were, mine was in the Lemonian wing, and
Right.
he was in the Munion wing.
Right.
So, you know, his,
A long time before.
yeah, you go down this way and there's there we are.
Yeah.
Back
That's
to
great.
that stone that they had to crawl through in Kansas to find a Davis Lemonian.
Yeah.
And then back from there.
Right,
Buried underneath them.
yeah. Is that where we had to scrape off the thing? I guess it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.